welcome to some more questions and answers here on the old Frontline. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. I've been down on the Somme battlefields in the last week, and there were some pretty challenging conditions down there with -5 as we came into Picardy that day. And while I was on the Somme visiting some of the cemeteries and having a think about future episodes and gathering some material for the podcast supporters newsletter, 2 questions came in that day alone, and the questions continue to come in on a regular basis, for which I'm very, very grateful. And to give you some idea just as to how many questions are coming in, we're just coming up to the end of November, beginning of kind of December period in terms of answering these. So there's quite a few to get through, which hopefully will lead to some interesting episodes. And remember, there's 2 main ways to send your questions in. That's email or through the Discord server, and there's links to both of those in the show notes with this episode. You can send in a question via fan mail, which is a link to the Buzzsprout server that hosts the podcast, and you can send kind of a text message in that way. But email and the Discord server is the best way, I think, because it enables me to keep track of these questions on a much easier kind of basis and make sure that I get round to answering them. So let's not muck around, let's get straight down to this week's questions, all of which have come in on email, and the first of those comes from David Boddy. David asks, my question relates to the naming of trenches. How did trenches or trench systems get their names, and was the naming of trenches done in a similar way by all the various armies? Well, we've often said on the podcast that when Europe went to war in 1914, it was prepared for war, but just not the kind of war that the First World War turned into, this vast siege with both sides entrenched along 450 miles of what became the Western Front, and then German and Austro-Hungarian troops facing the Russians on the Eastern Front as well, and then other fronts would develop as the war progressed, leading to trench systems there. And when you look at maps of these trenches or aerial photographs, or try to put yourself in the position of soldiers who were on those battlefields, faced not with an open landscape which they're fighting over or defending, but a system of trenches, this troglodyte world of the Western Front which it rapidly became, it's a complex place. How do you navigate it? How do you find your way through those trenches? And if you ever get a chance, or you've been to the battlefields today and you walk through the trenches at Vimy Ridge or in the Newfoundland Park, then you can see there already in those small kind of cross sections of what the Western Front once was, how complex the makeup of trenches were and how easy it would be to get lost. So naming became really important. Initially, you don't see any evidence of this in the early war diaries. They talk about trench systems, not all of which at that stage are completely connected up, but as that whole infrastructure of battlefield develops over the winter of 1914-15 on into the early part of the next year, then you do see trenches being named. And I think at first it was pretty random. If a London unit was in the line, and you see this at Plug Street, where the 5th Battalion, the London Regiment, the London Rifle Brigade were, a lot of the positions there were given, understandably, London names. And later on in 1915, on the Messines Ridge, for example, there was a road that ran from Wolvergum to Messines, cut across no man's land at one point, but in the approach to it, that road was a divisional boundary. And the 46th North Midland Division and the 48th South Midland Division at one point were holding both of those sectors. And there is, for example, a North and South Midland farm there. But if you look at some of the trenches in both of those areas, many of which were dug by those Midland Territorial soldiers, you see names reflecting places where they came from in their wider recruiting districts. So that's kind of how it developed. And then it got much more complex and perhaps organised with the creation of proper trench maps, because trench maps would be created not just covering the battlefield and the trenches that were defended by British soldiers. They would then be created showing trenches defended, of course, by the enemy, by German soldiers, and the land beyond that, much of which could not be seen from the forward positions on the battlefield, could only be seen from the air in a balloon or an aircraft or an air photo, whatever it was, but it had a trench system, and all of those needed to be named. And what you often see is that both for the Allied side and the enemy side, the men who made these trench maps, the intelligence officers who worked on them, would often pick a letter of the alphabet for a given area and name everything in that area after that letter of the alphabet. They'd take map squares, and in that given map square, they would pick a subject and name everything after that. So, for example, if we look at the ground around Passchendaele, many of you will know of or perhaps visited Tyne-Cot Cemetery. And that name did not come from Tyneside cottages, which were said to have stood on that ridge. It came from the fact that the officer who prepared the map of that area, long before any Australian or Canadian or British soldiers retook that ground in the 1917 battles, long before that, they, for example, in the case of Tyne-Cot, that area, they picked rivers and they named features on the battlefield after rivers. So there's a Tyne cottage, Tyne-Cot, and not far away there's a Thames house. So often it could be really random, the naming of some of these positions based on a letter of the alphabet or a particular kind of feature from which they would draw names from that. Now, the other factor to think about is when we look at trench maps, British trench maps, which were then used by Australians and Canadians, New Zealanders, South Africans, and all of the other Empire Commonwealth nations, we see German trenches marked on those predominantly because it was to give officers on the ground that kind of information. The names given to those trenches generally were made-up names by the British. Not always, because they would raid positions, capture enemy maps, and use those maps to then properly name the trench system there. So if you got into it, you could navigate your way down Leipzigstrasse into Berliner Strasse and turn left at Hamburgstrasse and so on. And the Germans, therefore, kind of named their trenches in exactly the sort of way that British soldiers do. And when you look at the many contemporary images of German soldiers in these trenches, you see notice boards up on the side of the trench just in the same way it was done on the other side of no man's land on the British side, and you see exactly the kind of names. You have trenches named after individuals, just as the British would do. There was a Heaton trench, for example, on the Hawthorne Ridge, which was almost certainly dug by young Second Lieutenant Eric Heaton's platoon in the lead-up to the first day of the Battle of the Somme and named after him. And on the German side, you see trenches named after favourite officers, NCOs, men who've been awarded Iron Crosses, all that kind of stuff, as well as trenches named after places and subjects. When we were filming Simon Verdigam doing the archaeological work at Messines, we got hold of a really good map of the German trenches at Messines, and he excavated a trench called Blauer Graben, for example. Blue trench, the bluish trench. That's the kind of immediate translation that kind of comes out of that. But then I later discovered that the Blauer Graben was a walking route in Bavaria, and these German soldiers who dug this trench were from Bavaria, so named the trench after an actual place which they had walked, no doubt, as young men. Now, the whole subject of naming these trenches, and that's a very kind of quick overview as to how it was done and how those trench names were shown both on signs in the trenches and maps used by both sides. It is a fascinating subject, and it's one that's been on my list to do a dedicated podcast about mapping and trench names, which I will do. There's a superb book on it, Rat's Alley by Peter Chassord, who had one of the best collections of trench maps that now forms an online archive based in Canada. And that book is highly recommended if you want to have a kind of gazetteer of trench names on the British side of the battlefield in the First World War. Now, I've not mentioned the French because this is such a big subject and we can't possibly in just a few minutes go into it all, but the French seem to have followed a similar kind of pattern where trenches were named after individuals and places and wider aspects. Sometimes you see battle honours from the past, from France's great military history, being given to the names of some trenches. Sebastopol Trench, Crayon Trench, not after the fighting on the Chemin des Dames in 1917, but the much earlier 1814 battle there, for example. So it's a big subject, and I will return to it on another day, but I hope that's given you a kind of quick overview of it. And certainly I would recommend kind of looking at not just Rat's Alley, the book, but if you kind of flick through the online images in the Imperial War Museum archive of trenches, you'll see quite a lot with trench names, trench boards up. And in the Imperial War Museum itself, there is quite a big display of these boards. They brought them home as war trophies, if you like, at the end of the First World War to be part of the museum's permanent exhibition. And it still is to this day in the new First World War galleries. And they're all totally original ones there, so it's well worth going there just to see those alone. So thanks for that one, David, and we're going to move on to question number 2. This comes from Andy Dodson. Andy says, I hope you're well. I have a question for the Q&A based on your most recent episode about pay, which brought back lots of memories of pay parades as a young sapper in basic training. Quite a few of you have said this, so thanks for that, Andy. And he asked, when a soldier, sailor or airman was listed as missing, what happened to their pay? Was it stopped at the day when they were listed as missing? What happened if they were listed as missing and then subsequently were found alive, either in their own lines or had been captured or were confirmed as killed in action? I can imagine at times it could be very difficult to determine a firm date when someone was last known to be alive, so how was a decision made as to when they should be paid up until? Well, this is a really good question, Andy, and you'd be surprised at how accurate date of deaths are. Sometimes you see a casualty and it's between this date and that date. That's not uncommon for the first day of the Battle of the Somme. But generally speaking, in a battle, in a unit, in a military unit of the British Army, in a platoon, the platoon commander had a roll book. Often the platoon sergeant had one too. And in that was listed everybody, who they were, name, rank, number, details of next of kin, some other information besides, sometimes religion, for example. So they knew which padre to call upon if the poor unfortunate soldier was killed in action. But that platoon roll book was used both before a battle, so an officer would mark who was there in his platoon, going to go into action, and then if he survived after the battle, he would then use it to read out the names to ascertain who were casualties and what had happened to these men. So there would be a parade, he'd read the names out. If you were there, you'd answer present. If you weren't there, of course, then you wouldn't answer at all. And then once all the names had been read, he'd go back over them and he'd ask the men to say what they'd seen happen to the men who were not present. And they'd say, well, Bill was killed going across no man's land, Arthur was hanging on the German wire, we saw Albert get captured by the Germans, that kind of stuff. So it meant that the officer had some information to pass back to base records, who'd pass that to the War Office, and eventually someone would come up with a often reasonably accurate date of death. Now, for many soldiers in big battles where there were lots of casualties, many of them were initially appointed missing. And at that point, it appears that their pay stopped because that was the potential end to their military service. So it was stopped. And then there would be, obviously, inquiries as to what happened to them. Some of them would turn up as having been killed in action on that day. So that obviously would be the end of their pay. But of course, not all missing soldiers were dead. Some of them were now in the hands of the enemy and were prisoners of war. But equally, that was considered by the War Office in the British Army as an end to their period of service. So they were no longer an active service. Having fought from their day of arrival through to their day of capture, that was their period of service. After that, they were prisoners of war, so they were not paid in the same way. I'm not 100% sure that they were paid at all. There was a reciprocal agreement under the conventions before the First World War that when soldiers were taken prisoner on a battlefield, the country which then hosted them as prisoners of war was meant to pay them something, not what they would have been paid in their own army, but a kind of token payment to ensure that they had food and other things. But when you read the whole history and experience of British prisoners in Germany in the First World War, it's not a good story in any shape or form. Men were poorly treated, terribly treated, brutally treated, in some cases murdered, and really at the kind of bottom end of the scale, often did not receive any food or any kind of nourishment on the scale that they should have been, and thousands of men died of sickness and disease as a consequence of this. And there are some very large prisoner of war cemeteries. So what it meant for the men who were captured, and we spoke about on a recent podcast episode on Our World War, the TV series from 10 years ago, the story of Sid Godley, who was captured at Nimy Bridge on the 23rd of August 1914 in the Battle of Mons with the 4th Royal Fusiliers. He then spent the rest of the war as a prisoner of war. So men like him would not be paid in the same way that they would be paid if they were fighting on a battlefield. Really, from the kind of War Office's point of view, they were failed soldiers. Their service had come to an end. They were no longer useful in terms of the military effort, so would not be paid in the same way, which meant hardship for them. They wouldn't be coming back to a big kind of amount of pay when the war was over. In the case of Sid Godley, maybe he thought he'd come back to 4 years' pay after being a prisoner of war, but I don't believe that he did, having spoken to some of his relatives and looked at the remaining records for him. He would have got a war gratuity when the war was over and things like that. And soldiers like him who were married, or if their parents depended on money from them, would continue to get something from the War Office in that respect, but the soldier himself would not be paid. So it's quite a brutal system, really, and for ordinary working class soldiers would have caused a lot of problems. And over the years of researching men in local newspapers, it is something that I've seen quite a lot. In the early period of the war, local newspapers were not under any kind of central control. They were not censored. And you see a lot of stories like this that you wouldn't see later on because the government stepped in and wouldn't allow this kind of thing to be published. So again, it's a subject, a much bigger subject, really. I would not claim to be an expert on army pay and the wider issues of it. But from what I can gather, soldiers who were missing, the cut-off date was the date they were considered to have been taken prisoner, and then once they were prisoners, they were not treated in a pay respect in the same way that they were when they were serving on a battlefield. And for the ones who were missing and found subsequently killed, obviously their pay went up to that point. And I know there were quite a few instances in which the War Office continued to pay men, and this is particularly so in the case of officers, until their death had been proven, because officers often had estates, they had wealth that they wanted to leave to somebody, and there needed to be probate, and then all that kind of process had to take place. And sometimes the War Office overpaid an officer. Although he was dead and wasn't taking that money, it still sat on his account and had been credited to his bank, wherever that bank was. Many of the officers banked with Cox & Co., which was one of the Army's principal bankers. And you see in officers' service records of the dead sometimes where the War Office is writing to parents and asking for that money back. It leaves a lot of bad taste in the mouth when you see how the families of the dead were often treated by officialdom in the Great War. It's not a good thing at all. And again, a fascinating subject, and one too big to really do much justice to here, but something that we will no doubt return to. And again, one of the kind of podcasts that's in the pipeline is looking at men who were prisoners of war. And as part of that, I'm going to look into the whole subject and pay, and we'll get a definitive answer as to what happened. And I'll look at some cases of soldiers who I know were captured and see what remains of the records for them as to what happened to the pay that they would have been entitled to if they'd been fighting. So it's a really good question, this, Andy, and I think it kind of cuts to the heart of what really inspired, prompted men to serve. Pay was an element, and particularly if you had families, because of the money you got for children, separation allowance, and all these other things that soldiers who were married got, it wasn't necessarily a replacement for a civilian wage, but sometimes it could be more than that civilian wage. So it was a reason for soldiers to join. But many men, particularly those early recruits, they were not inspired by pay. They were not impulsed by the idea of money to join and serve for king and country. It was a much bigger kind of question there, really. But once they were in the reality of what the army was, I think they realised the reality of pay and often how unfair it could be, particularly in the infantry, which is one of the lowest paid elements of the whole British Armed Forces in the Great War. So something no doubt we will return to. And if anyone's got any more kind of information on this, then please send it in. And we can add a bit more to what we all know about this subject of the Great War, the very purpose, I think, of these Q&As. So let's move on to question number 3. This one comes from John Benniker. I've been wondering why the Western Front line stopped at the Swiss border. What prevented either the Entente or Central Powers from crossing that border? If the Swiss army were to defend their borders, would it not have been seen as picking sides? Would it have resulted in another stalemate due to the nature of siege warfare, Switzerland being mountainous? However, that did not prevent fighting on the Italian front, for example. Well, a good question there, John. So the two ends of the Western Front were very different bits of terrain. At one end in the north, it ended on the beach, in the sand, and on the seashore of the Belgian coasts, and the join of the English Channel and the North Sea, close to the town of Newport. And at the other end, the trenches came together on where 1914 borders existed between Germany, France, and Switzerland, and that area today is called Kilometre Zero, because depending on how you look at it, does the Western Front start on the Belgian coast and end at Switzerland, or does it begin at Switzerland and end on the Belgian coast? I'll leave you to decide that one. Interestingly, those who've walked it over the years, 2 out of 3 who've written books on it have all started on the Swiss end of it and walked up to Belgium, whereas Nigel Jones, who wrote The War Walk in the 1980s, he started on the top section and he walked down. Anyway, getting slightly off the subject there. But if we look at that end of the Western Front, or beginning of the Western Front, we're on the border of Switzerland. So we're looking at 3 countries in 1914, because part of this ground was Alsace-Lorraine, which had been annexed by the Germans after the Franco-Prussian War. Then across the border was France itself, and then tucked in the corner was a bit of Switzerland. Now, Switzerland was a neutral country, and France and Germany were required to respect that neutrality. 1914 had showed that the Germans didn't respect neutrality because they had steamrolled their way through Belgium, another neutral country, en route to France as part of the Schlieffen Plan. But there never seems to have been anything where those sides considered to try and use Switzerland in a way to outflank the other side, whether the French would go through Switzerland or whether the Germans. I'm sure that it was considered, but they did have to contend, potentially, with fighting the Swiss army. And in that area that is today known as Kilometre Zero, on the Swiss side, you can walk to a point where there is a reconstructed bunker system showing the kind of defences that the Swiss army built there to keep an eye on the Germans on one side and the French on the other side to stop them from coming onto Swiss soil. So either side, if they tried to use that as a potential to outflank their enemy, would have had the Swiss army to contend with. Now, Switzerland's small. Its army today is small. I'm sure it was just as small then. Would it have been able to withstand attacks from the Germans or the French? That's a kind of what if, which I'm not really a great fan of. But what you see during those 4 years of static trench warfare is no attempt by the Germans or the French to try and get round. In fact, on the French side, there's a place you can go to just outside the village of Perfetta House, where there was a border post. The French kind of stood on one side looking at the Swiss, and the Swiss stood on the other side looking at the French. So it was stalemate on the border, just as it was stalemate on most of the 450 miles of the Western Front. So it's a kind of fascinating area, really. And the Swiss, we've mentioned this before on previous podcasts, Switzerland played quite an important role in the First World War. It was the headquarters of the International Red Cross that then looked after the welfare and needs and helped inform families of prisoners of war that they were captured and now in enemy hands at a prisoner of war camp, either in the theatre of war where they've been captured or taken back to that country's home country to be placed in a camp there, whether those are British prisoners in German camps or German prisoners in French and British camps, for example. And it was also a place where prisoners were exchanged. So I think because of that important role of Switzerland in the management of prisoners of war of both sides, I don't think the French or the Germans or anyone else would have wanted to antagonise the Swiss because of that vital role that they played in the management of prisoners of war. So that end of the Western Front and that static period of trench warfare that epitomised warfare along all 450 miles of those trenches that stretch from Switzerland up towards the coast, it was just as quiet around that border, near to the village of Professorhaus, close to the Swiss border, close to the German border, as it was pretty much anywhere else. And it's a fascinating area to visit. Now, of course, Alsace-Lorraine was returned to French soil after the Great War, so that whole area there is France bordering on Switzerland now, but you can go into the former German-occupied ground there, and you can see quite a lot of examples of German bunkers. You can walk a little track that takes you down towards that point, close to the kilometre zero, close to that point where the three borders met and where the Western Front ended. And there is the last couple of bunkers there. There's a very imposing observation bunker which overlooks the French trenches that the German soldiers occupied, and then an infantry shelter a little bit further down. And some years ago when I went there, I walked down to that, and it's way, way, way off the beaten track. And there was a bit of curled up barbed wire sitting on top of that bunker, which I did actually bring home with me, because that's a bit of barbed wire from either, as we've said, the very beginning or the very end of the Western Front. So quite an important and powerful object considering where it came from. So yet again, I've said that twice so far with both the previous questions. I know this is something that we will return to, because that part of the old front line in that bit of ground where once Germany and France and Switzerland came together, the beginning or the end of the Western Front, is something that's really important and deserves its own episode. So hopefully John will talk a lot more about life on that part of the Western Front down the line, as it were. So thanks for that, John, and let's move on to our fourth and final question, which comes from Paul Roberts. I first came across your podcast during lockdown and have followed you ever since. I bought many of the books you've mentioned and will shortly be working my way through your list of 10 YouTube documentaries. So first of all, thanks for that, Paul. And I know I've cost so many of you a lot of money when it comes to books, but you can never have enough books. And I'm afraid I will continue to recommend books ad infinitum as long as this podcast is still going. The YouTube documentaries that you mentioned there is a playlist that I put together, which is on the Old Frontline YouTube channel, where I've recommended, this was based on a previous question on Q&As, where I've recommended 10 videos from different channels where you can go on there, and hopefully they kind of pointers to where you can find good, reliable and interesting documentaries and films about the First World War on YouTube. So have a look at the Old Frontline YouTube channel and you'll find them there. Anyway, Paul, let's come to your question. Paul asks, if the Allies attacked on a front of, say, 5 miles wide, what happened to the troops at either side of that front, say a quarter of a mile outside the front area? Did they watch their comrades in arms battle away, or was the width of a battlefront decided by the geography of the land it was fought on? Now, we talk about landscape all the time on this podcast, and it's so important. The modern landscape, which we see mixed today with the landscape of the past, and then, of course, the contemporary landscape over which both sides fought during the Great War itself. And geography, and often geology, what's underneath, plays a really important role in how that battle was fought and where, geographically, where that battle was fought. So you do see attacks in which they're bordered perhaps by a canal or a river or a bit of impassable terrain, and the attack goes in that area there. But that doesn't mean that that bit of front line that the British, let's say, are attacking German positions over is in isolation, because there will be German troops either side of that canal and either side of that impassable terrain, just as there will be British troops. And those soldiers who were on the flanks of where that fighting is taking place, just as you assumed, Paul, would see what was going on. And I remember interviewing veterans who were in units that didn't take part in an attack. And the first day of the Battle of the Somme is a good example of this. So some of the men I interviewed who'd served in the Hull POWs, they were in reserve at Serre on the first day of the Somme. So they didn't take part in the actual assault. That was done by 8 other battalions in their division. But they stood back and they watched, and they could see these lines of men go into the waist-high grass in no man's land. They could see the machine guns cut down those men from Accrington and Barnsley and Bradford and Leeds and Sheffield and so many other places besides. And what that must have been like for them to know that their comrades going forward into what was said to be a cakewalk, a walkover, were actually being cut down and destroyed on the battlefield. So there's that kind of sad and terrible element to it where men did have to watch this. And a little bit further up from Serre, Gommecourt, where the diversionary attack took place, that was where the 56th London Division and the 46th North Midland Division attacked Gommecourt from 2 different sides. But that was also a different part of the line occupied by a different army. From Serre southwards, that was the 4th Army commanded by Rawlinson. But from Gommecourt northwards, that was the 3rd Army commanded by Allenby. And there were units that were on the flanks of those 2 formations that attacked Gommecourt that again had to not sit back from the battlefield and watch, but were in the forward trenches looking effectively to their right. The 13th Raw Fusiliers was a good example of that. They were in the front line area there, watching the attacks go in at Gommecourt, and again they had to see all that slaughter from a distance, knowing they couldn't affect the outcome of it, they couldn't participate, they couldn't go and assist. It must again been a very terrible and frustrating and awful experience for those men to go through, seeing the battlefield under those kind of conditions, but also, of course, getting an insight into what potentially the fighting on the Somme would be like. And the 13th Raw Fusiliers suffered a lot of casualties in the subsequent fighting of July and on into the months that followed in their experience in the Somme battle. So while when we often talk about battles and attacks in given areas, we are kind of looking at them in isolation, they're never in isolation, because going back to the previous question about the end of the Western Front, there aren't any gaps in the line. There isn't a place where one side can go around the other, or just because a battle takes place on an 18-mile front, as it did on the first day of the Somme, that doesn't mean that there isn't something going on either side of those 18 miles, or there aren't continuous trenches beyond those 18 miles, and there aren't men in those trenches either side of those 18 miles, for example. So it's historians, I guess, that kind of pick these places and almost kind of pull them out of the wartime landscape and then understand them, discuss them, study them, and draw conclusions from them. But they were never really in isolation during the war itself. But what it shows once more is the importance of landscape. I can never talk about landscape enough on this podcast, really. Both that landscape of the past and then the landscape of the present, and the way both of those landscapes kind of weave together in our layered understanding of the First World War, whether that's France and Flanders, Gallipoli, Salonika, the Italian front, whatever it is. So I hope that's kind of answered your question, Paul. And again, it's kind of hinted at a much wider subject that I'm sure we will return to in different ways in future Q&As, and indeed perhaps even in future podcasts. So that's it for this week. I hope the questions and indeed the answers have been of interest. Thanks to all of those who submitted them, and thanks to all of you who continue to submit these questions. You can do that, as we've said, in the 2 main ways, via email and the Discord server, and there's links to those in the show notes. So, see you again in a couple of weeks for some more questions and answers on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.